takes a minute to find that. So we are recording now, and we are here today to meet with Janet Topolsky with the Aspen Institute, and she's going to share with us about rural development hubs. And so let me give you a little bit more information about Janet. She's with the Aspen Institute and has more than 40 years of experience across the nation working on community development strategies. She's currently the executive director of Community Strategies Group at Aspen. She has specialized in peer learning work and facilitation in family asset building, which I think aligns with many of the board members' interests in building self-sufficiency in your communities, and in just doing economic development differently, and also in community development philanthropy, which aligns with the model that the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky is using for the work that it's doing. It's doing community development philanthropy. And so basically what you all are doing, or you're creating this place-rooted foundation to improve the local economy in Eastern Kentucky and Appalachian Kentucky and the overall quality of life. And so that's why we felt like that the rural development hub model is something that would be helpful for you all to hear about. And so I am going to stop sharing my screen at this point and turn it over to Janet. Oh, and Janet, you're muted. Can you unmute?
Sorry, my screen was lagging already.
Yeah. So Janet is having a few internet issues today, so we'll just bear with her if things lag a little bit. So thank you.
Right, and I'm going to share my screen now too, because I want to be able to run through this particular presentation that I put together for you. I've used with others, changed a little bit when I learned. I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. And also, I want to mention that, and I find it important to do this every once in a while. I've got a little bit of Kentucky street cred because my father grew up in Lynch, Kentucky in Harlan County. And I've been there, and I actually have had a drink at Jerry's house too in Hazard. So there you go. So it's not like I don't know anything, right, about all of this. And so now, oh, finally we've got the screen share there. So what I want to do is just quickly, spend about 15-20 minutes talking about this rural development hub concept, because I think it really is very important to the work you're doing, but let you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. So as Donna said, I'm at the Aspen Institute Community Strategy Group. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. with the Aspen Institute, but we do work all over the country. And since 1980, I've been there since 1993. So this is my 28th year there. And I've done work in every state of the union while I've been at Aspen CSG, and with organizations in every state of the union. Over 75% of our work is in rural, and it's with community leaders who are focused on helping community leaders learn from each other when they're really trying to both build more prosperous regions, but also trying to help people, places, and businesses on the economic and social margins get ahead at the same time, right? So our work falls into, as Don already said, we do work on how do you help families get ahead. We do work on how do you do economic development differently in rural, which is largely what I'll talk about today, and also in community development philanthropy. How can foundations that are in local places play a more robust role in doing these other two things, right? So what I want to do today is really talk about what we mean by success in community and economic development. What are we really driving for? I want to talk a little bit about how some places are doing development differently, and also talk about rural development hubs and hub-like action, or hubby action, if you want to call it that way. So let me start with those first two objectives that I just had on the screen. So, I think the way to think about this very simply, and, I developed this slide years ago and found that it sort of has a lot of resonance with people. So I'd like to start with it, is that, in rural communities across the US and across Native nations in the US, we have a lot of, hungry families or hungry children, right? And there are different ways we can go about trying to address that situation. And when I think about community foundations, I think about, well, you have many options, right? And one is to feed the people who are hungry, which is a very good thing to do and always has to be done. Someone needs to be doing it because you want people, to be hungry. You don't want them to be hungry. But the problem is if all you're doing is feeding people, they'll come back tomorrow and they're going to be hungry again, right? So something has to change in the situation. So besides feeding people, which once again is a good and important thing to do, what can you do to make a difference so they aren't hungry tomorrow? And one thing is to sort of look at the family structure and say, well, they're hungry because the parents aren't earning enough money. So what can we do to help the parents, reduce their costs or prepare themselves, repair finances, better credit scores, all that kind of stuff, or prepare themselves to get a job or get a better job so that they're making more money and they can afford to buy food. So that's unlike the first one, which is treating the symptoms, which are hunger. This is more like curing the disease. But then another thing that you can do as a community foundation is to support strategies to grow the local economy so that there's a larger supply of good jobs, right? Because if all you do is option 2 here and there aren't good jobs for them to move into, they're just going to move away. So there's a range of things here that you can consider when you're figuring out what is the strategy for our community foundation, right? Or our affiliate foundation to do. You can't do everything all at once, but can you move up this ladder a little bit? Because you really want, if you're trying to do what we call economic development philanthropy or community development philanthropy, you want to move towards something transformative. Don't just cure the disease, prevent the disease over time. And so that's just one way to get in your head what we're really talking about. So we call this sort of like community wealth building when you're really trying to move up that ladder towards curing and preventing the disease. And basically say, if you're really trying to do economic development, you're going for 3 kinds of outcomes. One is, and I'll talk about this in a minute, you want to grow multiple forms of capital, not just financial capital, right? Return on investment is not enough, right? You want to increase local ownership of all those capitals, because only if you have local ownership do you have in your community the ability to make decisions about the use of those capitals, right? And that's a really key thing. Just think about the closure of rural hospitals that's happening partly because ownership of those hospitals is not in those communities anymore. They're not doing everything they can to keep your hospital open if they're off in, some major city and all they're looking for is their bottom line and efficiencies, right? They don't understand the spillover effects the hospital has on the community as an anchor, right? And so local ownership of as many capitals as possible, and it's not just financial ownership, it's like, think of a skill. If we need a skill to make something happen in our community, do we have that skill in someone in our community? Or do we have to bring someone in to help, right? If you've got local skill, that's ownership of a skill. So you have to think of ownership in a very broad way here. And finally, you want to design development efforts, community or economic development or family development in such a way, at the front end, you have to think about how can we do this in a way that brings the people on the margin or the businesses on the margin to the table at the front end so they can advise us on how we design our work so it's going to help them get ahead. If you don't ask that question at the front end, how can we do this in such a way that low wealth people, places, and firms do better? You likely won't design so that they will do better. So we have to bring people into the room to help us design what we're doing. So these are the 3 things to sort of keep in mind. Now, I want to talk about that capital a little bit. And the way I like to talk about it is like, let's say people think the word capital or assets, they always think it's all about money. It's only about money, right? And what I like to say, if I threw this bag of money in the middle of the room, and walked away for a year and came back, it would still be a bag of money. It wouldn't be anything else, right? So capital is not just money. It's all the assets that can contribute to the well-being of people, places, and economies. So when we talk about capital, we say there are sort of 8 critical forms. There's individual. There's the people in your place. Do they have good skills that you need? Are they healthy enough to work or to participate? do they have the education? And then intellectual capital is, what do we know how to do in this region? What are our sort of intellectual assets in terms of collectively, what do we know how to do together? Do we have social capital, trust, relationship, networks? If people don't trust each other in a community, they're likely to work together to make anything happen. Cultural capital, sort of, you just think about all the music traditions in Appalachia, and I can go on and on about all of that. Quilts, all the quilts on my bed were made in Appalachia. You know what I'm saying? It's just sort of like, that's culture, and it's something you can build on. Natural capital, it goes without saying, you understand the importance of that. Built capital is your buildings, your broadband, your sewer systems. Political capital is the influence you have on decision makers like Joe Manchin, for example. I understand that's not Kentucky, but you get my point. Financial capital. So financial is one of the capitals, but it's these other 8 and other 7 and how you use them that make a difference in what happens. And so we have to pay attention to what's happening to them in our development plans and decisions and measure if they're getting better. And the whole point is, can you design development to use as many as possible to improve them, but not damage any? And that's another key thing we like to talk about. So as I already said, you want to also increase the local ownership of them as much as possible, because that's an anchor that helps make wealth stick. And the other thing is, you want to design with low wealth people, places, and firms at the table at the front end, because then you're going to become more resilient over time. So those are 3 things to keep in mind. So doing development differently, as we talk about, means place-rooted organizations like yours, using your full range of assets, all of those capitals. When I say capitals and assets, I mean the same thing, all 8 of those. Use them all, as many as you can, to build more prosperous as well as inclusive regions. Now, this is a challenge. This is not easy, right? And I know when it comes to especially affiliate foundations of community foundations, I mean, you might have an all-volunteer board, no staff, whatever, working in one community or one county. In some cases, I know you work in multi-counties, but it's hard to do this all alone as one organization. It's hard to pull off in just one community. Most issues cross geographic boundaries. So if you're located in one county, but the next county over has the same problem, it's not like if you solve it in your county, there's not going to be spillover from the county that didn't solve it, and vice versa. And here's another thing I like to point out. Okay, I'm from this great state of Michigan. My father's family during the Depression did move up to Detroit. So I was born in Detroit, right? But being from Michigan, everyone from Michigan holds this up. I also do this for the Upper Peninsula, right? This is the Upper Peninsula here. So this is Michigan. But for the Lower Peninsula, sometimes you ask people, where are you from? And they say, I'm from the thumb, right? Meaning this part of the state, right? And so they don't say I'm from a certain town. They say I'm from the thumb, right? Well, why can they do that? They can do that because, the people in the thumb have similar economic base. They have some similar culture. They share some challenges. They share some opportunities. They share the thumb coast, as they call it, right? So they have a lot of commonalities, but there's no government of the thumb, right? There's no one who can make decisions on behalf of the thumb. There's no one who can collect money just for use in the thumb. There's no one who can then say, let's invest in the thumb together, unless someone takes that on, right? And sort of is not the government, but really tries to bring the thumb together. So that's a critical issue. And there's also this lingering thing in our country that we think the job of doing development is to recruit businesses from outside. And if we just land some big business, that's going to solve all of the problems in our community, including people's skill problems and hunger problems and this, that, and the other. And that's simply not going to happen. In addition to which, there aren't enough companies, large companies, that can be recruited into every rural community in the world. So really, your starting point is the assets you have and how you can build on those assets and organize them to make something happen in your community so that you're growing from within and therefore becoming more attractive to others as well. So those are the challenges. So what we've observed over years of working across the country is that there is a breed of organizations in rural places that they're not the government, but they are pulling the region or the community together to do stuff, and to be able to work together. And these are the most creative organizations in rural America in many cases. So what we did, because we saw this, is we decided we were going to do some research by interviewing some of these organizations. And so we then gave them a name, and we gave them a name, Rural Development Hubs, because in one place they might be a community foundation. 2 counties over or 2 states over, it might be the United Way, or it might be a community college playing this role, or it might be a community development financial institution, or it could be, there are lots of different organizations that take this role on. It's not reliably the same kind of organization across the country, but they share certain characteristics. So, but they would, they are working hand in glove with the people and organizations within their region to build inclusive wealth, going at those 3 things I talked about, increasing local capacity, and creating opportunities for better livelihoods. So that's what's going on. So this is our research. We talked to 43 of them. And as you can see on this slide, there are lists of lots of different kinds of organizations that qualified. Well, we asked them how they thought about their work and what challenges they had and what would help them do more. And so this is what we learned, and that research sets them apart. And I call them the gritty dozen because they are things that show these organizations have grit. They have the grit to do what needs to be done. First of all, they tend to think about the region, not just their one little slice of the pie. So if you think, about any organization you want, Boys and Girls Club, Future Farmers, you can think about Chamber of Commerce, you can be very insular, the Chamber of Commerce for one community, and try to improve things for business in your community. But if you join forces, maybe with other chambers in the county, you're going to get further faster, if you're able to do that. And so they think regionally. They say, what's going on in the region, right? And can we work together on an issue or an opportunity we all share? And then they assemble the region for dialogue. It might be around one critical issue or critical opportunity, but they tend to bring people together, right? That's one aspect of these organizations. They are in the region, they are of that place, and they know the place. And they know the place because they show up in the place. They get to know people, they show up at meetings, they're very aware of what's going on. And they take the long view. They're not just thinking short term, well, if you think about it in terms of businesses, what can we tell our shareholders this quarter, right? I don't care about 2 years from now. I just want to look good this quarter. They're thinking over the long term about what do we have to do today so that things are much better 2 years from now, 5 years from now. And I mean, Mike Claiborne, who's at the CREATE Foundation, a community foundation in Northeast Mississippi, I think really summed this up when he said, when you look at how a region functions, these imaginary lines of cities and counties don't mean a lot in terms of economic development and how people are able to better themselves. It's sort of where are the resources we need to work on what it is we have in front of us, right? And how can we bring those together? So that's one. These are 4 of the gritty dozen. Now, the next thing, say they bridge issues in silos. So quite often people working on, for example, helping increase family security, economic security, like improved credit scores and whatever, they don't think they have anything to do with workforce development, or they don't think they have anything to do with business development, but they do. And what these rural development hubs tend to do, they tend to bring people together that sort of live and work and only think in their silos and help them understand from each other what they have in common so they'll join forces. That's another thing. They tend to look at whole systems, right? So you think about something like childcare in rural, there are lots of pieces to that. Childcare centers, you're not paying attention to the at-home childcare, you're not paying attention to what some of the employers are experiencing because people don't have childcare. They're thinking about the whole system. They're not thinking about what's the government funding support and what doesn't it support. So they tend to think about, let's figure out the whole system and not just analyze one aspect of it and try to fix it. think about that hunger example I gave you earlier. I mean, it's in thinking about the system that you move up the ladder there. If all you're thinking about is the symptom, you're just going to feed people, right? But the system makes you think about, well, why aren't the parents doing better? And what can we change in that system? They collaborate as a way of doing business, and they create ways to collaborate together. And this is where I said, like, there's no government of the thumb, right? So if I live in the thumb of Michigan, and I know a lot of people who want to invest in some innovation we're doing, who can collect that money and hold that money? You got to have a structure for that. That isn't one of the city towns. So a community foundation, for example, can be that kind of structure. So they create structures to foster collaborative doing. And I think John Molinaro, who used to be a community foundation, not unlike Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky up in West Central Minnesota, and then worked with one in Appalachian, Ohio as well. He said, in a rural place, there aren't enough resources to go it alone, right? And so the model for collaboration that's essential to rural America is the church potluck supper. Everyone brings what they can to the table, and you end up with more than you need to get your job done. And it's sort of a loaves and fishes kind of thing, but it's true. And you just won't get it done unless you work together. But you sort of need a hub or a hub-like activity or action structure to make that happen. And the final things I would say about the gritty dozen is hubs tend to translate, span, and integrate action between local and national actors. And right now, this is critical. Think about this. How much money is coming down from the federal government through, the CARES Act, through the infrastructure bill, through the potential, reconciliation jobs bill? There's going to be unprecedented amount of federal money in a one time in a generation or in our lifetime dump of money. I don't mean that in a bad way, that will come into communities. And we're working on another part of our work. We're working to try to get much more of that, as much as we can, to be more flexibly designed so that it can be used flexibly in rural places. But if you got to have someone who sort of like is keeping track of what's happening, so that they can say, hey, we've got this project or the initiative or this system thing we're trying to put together, and these federal dollars could be used for that. But right now, money that flows to rural comes from 400 different federal programs. And how can, every community, rural community in the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky jurisdiction and your affiliates know how to traverse all of that? So a hub can help sort of say, learn some of that, so that they're spanning and finding out what can we use from other from regional and national actors that can help us do what we want to do locally. The other thing that hubs do is they flex and innovate and become what they need to do to get the job done. So for example, the foundation in West Central Minnesota that I talked about years ago, 25, 30 years ago, when they first got started, they found out there was I would say a business lending gap. There was, when you're trying to build a business, you have to put together a capital stack of different kinds of lending, from banks, from some investors, some from government, to sort of build the business. And sometimes you can't, there's a little piece of money you need in the middle, and no one will provide it. So the whole deal falls through. And what their foundation did is they found out that there was this gap in this West Central Minnesota region. So the community foundation started doing business lending before a rural community foundation, before a lot of national or big city foundations were doing business lending. Rural foundations were doing it because they saw someone has to do this and there's no one else who will do it. So that's just one example of something community foundations did not used to do business lending. Now a lot of them are doing it because they're filling a gap that no one else will fill. And that's what hubs do. They start taking on the aspects of other kinds of organizations, because you can't have in every rural community one of these, one of these, one of these, and one of these. So they tend to be what I would say polyglot organizations by the end. They take risk, calculated and tolerate it, and they tolerate it. So they fail sometimes, but at least they've tried and they learn from that. And they hold themselves accountable to the whole community. They make it really clear, or try to the community, we're doing this to help things get better for you. So they really do engage people in understanding what they're doing. So Jenny Stevens down in the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, South Carolina, said this: we're accountable to the people whom we serve and to our investors. So it's both. One thing we have going for us is the trust of the community. If we ever lose that, we're going to be out of business. And that certainly is true for community foundations, because if people don't trust you, if you fail and you don't explain why, we tried this because it was important. And yes, we didn't succeed necessarily as well as we thought we would, but this is what we've learned. And so we're going to do better next time. That kind of transparency makes people trust you, right? You don't hide stuff under a bushel, because you want people to continue to donate and build your endowment, right? Or your pass-through funds. And so trust is actually quite important. So, I mean, I think that, you know, we really need more rural development hubs, or more rural organizations to sort of work together to act in a hub-like way in order to have a really strong rural development ecosystem in this country. And so there are many, many different ways that they can be strengthened, and you're not in charge of strengthening them throughout, but we're making the point right now to many in the federal government that as these funds come down, you shouldn't just send them to the state. You shouldn't just send them only to local governments. You should be looking at these intermediary organizations that are hubs, because they're doing some of the creative work. And they need more flexible support to build their capacity and to do what they know needs to be done: locally led community and economic development. So, you know, we're working on this middle part, trying to design policies and programs with rural implementation in mind, and detect and eradicate systems that disadvantage rural America. There's a lot of advantages given to urban places in terms of how money comes down through the federal pipes, and we're fighting that too. So that's one way to strengthen hubs. But we really need to, you know, do ourselves, you know, help policymakers and other foundations or investors understand the reality of rural, and that's something that you can do, and help them understand what success looks like in rural, because it's not just jobs. And a lot of government and philanthropic programs, you know, larger philanthropy say, well, show us how many jobs you've created, when that's really not necessarily the measure that's best to sort of say, we've got momentum, we're changing, you know, cost per participant is not a good measure. And we're doing other work, and in our other work, we're trying to suss out what some better measures of success are for rural development. So, and then I think, you know, yourselves, what you really want to try to do is act in a more hubby way, you know, do some of those things, think more about the systems, et cetera. So that's basically what I had to say. And I'm happy to talk about rural development hubs or anything y'all are doing, but I just wanted to share that and really thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to bring the screen down now. Oh, by the way, before, you know, you all, well, you all got some copies of the Hubs report. I think you sent them out. So there you go. Hey, I hold mine up too. There you go. Just so you know, keep it next to me at all times. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff in there too about sort of the history of how we got to where we're at now too. It's useful to know that when you're talking to people. So I'm gonna stop share now, and I'll take it back to you, Donna, and whatever you want to do next is fine with me. Okay. I'm trying to stop the share anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I could do that for you. So, let's throw things over or open for questions or comments from folks that are on the call here. And to get us started, one of the things that we might think about is we have been doing these strategic plans for the affiliates and looking at, you know, what are the investments that you want to make in your communities around financial investments, of course, the funding that you're raising, but also time and effort and leadership of the board members and of volunteers that you might engage in your work. And so I'm just interested to hear from you all what connections that you might see either with those capitals that Janet talked about earlier in the presentation, or just in the Rural Development Hub concept overall. If you all have thoughts about that. Not a small question, is it?
Well, I'll jump in there. And, I think it's so interesting that you were talking about that success looks different in rural areas. I just spent some time last week in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. And that is one of the 2 only counties in all of Appalachia that are affluent. And so I was driving around in those areas, and I'm like, just driving around, you can't tell the difference. They had some places that weren't as pretty as others. They did not have a trash or litter issue that surprised me, and so forth. But so in your observation, I mean, I know what I think success looks like in rural America, but what are you seeing as markers of success in these places that have these hubs?
Can I ask you what you think?
I think it looks good on paper is what I think. I think success is you look at it on paper and suddenly you see that the median income of your population is the same as most of the other counties in the country.
Mm-hmm. What do other people think? The reason I'm not dodging your question,
Sure.
but everything I've learned from folks like you on the ground who are doing the hard work. So in fact, we're conducting an entire series of conversations about this size right now with people saying, what do you think we should measure as rural development success?
Yeah.
Well,
in other words, because we've got government asking us, well, if you don't want us to measure jobs, what should we measure? So I'd love to hear what you had to say about that.
Sure.
This is Melissa, and I'm in Hazard. Again, we're all over here, but we are in a little bit of a different area. And we all have different counties. I also work at Hazard Community and Technical College, and some of our service counties, and I don't know if anyone on this call is in one of those counties or not, but are some of the poorest in the nation, not just in the state, but in the nation. And it's really kind of dismal. But there is a well-being index that floats around out there. Now, how many people pay attention to that? I'm not sure. But are people healthy and happy? Now, do we assume that that can only come from a median income wage? Maybe. I don't know. Obviously, if you don't have money to buy food, then you are not healthy and happy. But I still wonder if there is not a contentment index. I don't know. But, we don't all have to make, 6 figures to be very content and fulfilled and happy within our community. Now, people can't starve. People can't not have access to medical care. But how do you measure that? I'm not sure. But without coming back, I mean, Sandy's point is well taken. When I look at the numbers, I'm looking at hard numbers. I mean, I pull up census.
Yeah.
I want to see how many people are participating in the labor market. I want to see how many people are educated. I want to see what the poverty rate is. I want to see what the unemployment rate is. I do look at those hard statistics. But then on the soft side, and Sandy and other folks, you all know what I'm talking about. There are people here that live in my community that are thriving and happy and content. And they don't have doctorates, and they're not making 6 figures, and they are happy. And I don't mean fake happy. I mean happy. They're not moving out of the area, I mean, they're staying here. I also know of folks that have come here from outside the area. We call them sometimes the orphans, because they come to us through AmeriCorps, and they come to us through Teach for America, and they come to us as Vistas or Kentucky Highlands Fellows, those kinds of folks. And guess what? They stay. And, could they have gone on and done big, bad things? Yeah, sure. But they decided to stay. So I don't know. I would hope that there's a measure besides just what's on paper. But I agree, Sandy, when I'm, you know, unfortunately here in my neck of the woods, I have to tell the poor, pitiful me story over and over. And so I'm always using those statistics.
And I think that equates to pride in where you live. And the pride relates to happiness. You know, I taught school for many, many years on such a poverty schools, such a high poverty rate. And then you saw some families who were totally happy, and some families like, there's nothing to do here. I don't like this place. That, you know, my daddy doesn't have a job. So I think it's a lot of pride, and I would love to see communities that had a pride in where they live. And it's like you say, I certainly don't make six figures, never have, never will. But at the same time, I'm one of those happy people.
Yeah, I want to build on what both you and Melissa said. Jane Dyke, I live in London, Kentucky, and it's one of the counties, because of our location, and I think also in part because of the people who have gathered here, we continue to push forward. We applied for a community block grant for a food distribution center. We were the only county that didn't qualify, but all the counties that were going to be served by it did, so we could get the $400,000 block grant here for a God's Pantry food distribution center. We knew we could run it right. We knew we had people here who would do well with it. I'm a lawyer, but I wasn't always a lawyer. I worked for the Cooperative Extension Service. So for 13 years, I worked with low-income families in counties from Harrison to Harlan County. I made home visits. I had 36 paraprofessionals I trained. And I would spend 2 days a year. So 72 days a year, I was in the homes of families that were served by the Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program. And Claudia and Melissa, I understand completely what you were saying. There were some people who were at ease where they were doing what they were doing. I've been in homes that where they swept the yard because it was hard packed dirt. And it was just incredibly clean and tidy and well kept inside. And then I've been in government provided housing that was horrible. The roaches crawling on the breakfast dishes on the table, and the rabbit in the cage in the living room. I never figured that one out.
So,
and I've been a prosecutor. You know, you don't know, but I prosecuted dependency neglect abuse cases for 8 years. Those are terrible. I mean, I've seen pictures of things that you cannot believe exist in the civilized world. I think I don't know how you know what success is. I don't know that there's a measure of success that goes across more than one environment. I think communities have to define what their success is.
see, Jane, you've got it right there. You know, the sort of sticky wicket we're sitting in the middle of is you've got these resource providers, in some cases, larger foundations, you know, national foundations, governments saying, well, what do you want us to measure? Because they want something easy. They want the silver bullet measure like jobs, right? Or numbers of loans or, you know, default rates. And the truth is that it's like a family or an individual. Everyone is different. And we need a system to reconstruct a system in which rural places can define for themselves what success is. So let me give you an example. I mean, and this might be of interest to some of you for other reasons. We've done a lot of work on different approaches to families getting ahead. And one of the approaches called 2-generation or whole family. And it's sort of like, don't just work with the parents, don't just work with the kids, work with the whole family at the same time. And there's
the grandparents are raising the kids right now, so you might as well look at.
Well, right. And so whole family would include 2-generation. They know as a misnomer, but it's people call it that now, but it's also really whole family. It's grandparents, it's aunts, uncles, whatever. So, you know, the point is you have to sit down and say, what status is the whole family in? And what are the goals to get the whole family ahead? Not just let's improve the kids' schooling. If the kids' schooling improves and they go home to, you know, a homestead that is in disarray, it's not going to stick. Same thing is if you sort of like work on the parents doing better, but the kids in a bad situation in school or whatever, it's not going to stick. So you really need to be looking at the whole family. So there's an organization in Western Maryland, in Appalachian, Maryland, called Garrett County Community Action. It's a community action program, and they do this whole family thing, and they've come up with a crisis to thriving scale. And they've taken things like housing or savings or transportation, things that families need. And they created a scale that they can sit down with a family and the family can circle, this is where we're at, this is where we're at. So in other words, like, we have no car and there's no public transportation, or we have a car, but it's broken down and we can't afford insurance, or we have, so you basically have a family fill this out and then look at it and say, well, which one of these do you want to move on? Right? What are your goals? Which 2 or 3 things do you want to improve first? Because they're going to be more important to improving the other ones. And then they work with the family on that plan. If you think about your community or your region, you can sort of do the same thing. Take the different things that you need to sort of, and what is our current status? Is our downtown in good shape? Or is it totally closed down? Are there a few anchor stores, but they're looking seedy? Are there, you can come up with a scale and then look at different communities and see where are they on this, and bring the community together and say, what do we want to work on first? So, and then figure out a way to work on it. That way, you build some ownership of A, what do we want to do? And B, oh, thanks for putting the link in there, Melissa. I was going to send around to you afterwards, but, already done. So in my view, it's really up to the community what success looks like. But the question is, who's involved in determining what success looks like? Is it only the haves, or does it include the have-nots? Is it only the happy, or does it include the unhappy, right? So it's really sort of, how do we do sort of a self-assessment as a community about where we want to go? And then let's choose 1 or 2 things to work on. And then when you start making progress on those, what you do is build energy. And this is the thing, when you talked about, I think it was you, Melissa, who said, I'm always talking about our need. My observation over many, many years is that the money that comes down from government, as well as philanthropy, as well as private investors, goes to energy, not to need. And if we're in a competition to get resources based on my free and reduced school lunch numbers are higher than yours, right? Or percentages are higher than yours, that's a losing battle, right? Give us more because we have, more hungry kids in school is not the answer for long-term investment. And it's not a way to talk to your community about ourselves, because you're only just telling everyone, hey, we're depressed here, we're depressed here. You sit and have a pity party all the time. And that ain't gonna move anyone towards action. It's just sort of like, everything's so overwhelming, we can't do anything.
But
right?
the argument that I will, or the counter argument I will say to that is, that's the way the federal funding is set up. Is the federal funding, the very first section in your application is need. It's not what are your successes, where are you moving forward, how great are you doing? It's what is your need. And when you look at the points allocated to these funding streams, right, need is a significant point factor. Now, your program or your implementation, your project description is the highest, but need is significant. And so I agree with you. Now, what I do is, and I've always told, because I teach a grant writing class, is I agree with you that funders don't want to fund you just because you're getting ready to close your doors, or because everything has just gone to, hell in a handbasket. You can't do anything about it. So we do tell the good stories, and then we do tell where we're making progress and where we are moving. But a lot of their decision is to put money where they think it needs to be the most. So, we're in a quandary of having to balance, like you say, balance that whole, we're doing great and we're making progress and we've got key invested people, but we're still poor, pitiful me.
Right. But just think about this in terms of, if you had, $100,000 to give to one community and you had two come in and they had equal need, but one of them had actually done something, who would you give it to? And you give it to someone that you know has tried, and they may not have succeeded, but at least they can tell you what they learned. It's just the same as a business loan. Part of it, when downtown banks used to lend to business, it was partly based on the character of the person they were giving it to. So what is your community's character in terms of taking stuff on, right? That's one way to think about it. I think, it really interesting. There's this a wonderful rural development action hero, as I like to call her, named Cheryl Lee Hills also in rural Minnesota, different part. And she said to us a few weeks ago that when the government asked her to report on money that they've gotten or funder or foundations, and all they ask is to report on X, Y, and Z, she also reports on A, B, and C. And they said, well, you don't need to report on that. She said, I know you don't require it, but you need to read this because you need to know what success really looks like for us. So in other words, can you engage? Can you help change the mindset of the funders by telling them what really is important? Don't just fill their requirements in terms of reporting or measurement. Say, I know you wanted us to report on this, that's fine, but the measures that really matter for us are X, Y, and Z. We have a bottom-up education job to do, because we've been, and I say this especially to the folks in Appalachian, have been in such a reactive position when it comes to the government and to outside decision makers making decisions about what happens in our communities. So we gotta stand together and stand firm and tell them what does make a difference, right? So that's what.
Janet, I want to go back though. I mean, you're at the Aspen Institute. You had to find these rural places that made you lead to there being this development hub idea. What was it about those that pulled you in and said, oh, you're an example of it, and you're an example of it? Because I mean, did they just come to you and say, oh my gosh, we think regionally? Or were you able to, so was it a demographic of something that caused you to look at them closer? How did you find them and know that they were successful and unique?
Well, part of it is just years of work in the field, and you get to know people.
Okay.
I mean, you get to know people and you see they're doing totally unusual things, right? And there are jillions more people doing amazingly innovative things, but we've been doing peer learning on the ground with lots of different initiatives across the country for years. And you see some organizations that really are, before they decide what they're going to do as a program, they don't just, hey, let's set up a program to do X, Y, and Z. They go around and talk to everyone. I mean, when I talked about West Central Initiative doing business lending, it's because John Molinaro went and talked to a whole bunch of businesses in their 9-county region and said, what's keeping you from getting ahead? And what they said is, we need new technology. And then he asked them, well, why don't you get it? Well, we can't get the loan for the technology because the banks won't give us, we've got this gap. And then he said, well, we can fill that. But then there was another problem. The problem is they didn't have workers that could use the new technology. Yeah. So then they built a partnership with the State Manufacturing Extension Center and with the community colleges and the businesses to train people on the job while they were being paid to use that particular piece of machinery. So it was looking at the whole system of and some of those businesses went from garages to employing 200 people. And it never would have happened if they hadn't gone around and talked. So if you're trying to help childcare centers, you got to talk to the people at the childcare centers enough to figure out what's the real problem. Just like when you're talking to families, a whole bunch of families that are trying to increase their credit scores. Well, what's the real issue? And it may not be the same issue for everyone, but there might be 3 clear kinds of things to work on. So what I would say what they have in common is they talk to the people, organizations that are trying to help before they design what they do. It's not just, oh, kids have nothing to do after school, let's set up a skateboarding program,
Right.
When you don't really have any place to skateboard, or you don't have this, that, and the other. I mean, you've got to sort of really think about, what do we need to do this? That's what I would say.
Okay.
It's, and once they do that on one thing and it works, they then do it on the next thing. That's just it. And they build trust. They build record and credibility and trust.
So it's not just always build it and they will come. So you have to have
Right.
a background. And
It's not a field of dreams approach.
Yeah.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. And there's a lot of that. I mean, the federal government does it. State government does it. Oh, let's set up an X program. I mean, it's like, just think about all the workforce development programs that have been set up that were for jobs that don't exist in that community.
Yeah.
I talked to someone yesterday who they've got a prison and they're really concerned about prison reentry, right? But what they did is they said, okay, we've got construction going on in the community. They can't hire enough people to work. So they put together with a union, they formed a partnership with a union to put together curriculum to teach construction trades to people while they were in prison, with the understanding that when they came out, they would fill one of the jobs that was open. Now, talk about thinking about the system, right? You have an economy that has some good jobs, but people without the skills to fill those jobs, and that's keeping those companies from doing better and construction from happening. And you've got, all these folks in prison that really want to come out, but they don't come out with any security. And so many fall back into recidivism or into poverty. And so, where was the gap there? The gap was when they got out of prison, there wasn't anything. They didn't have anything new to offer, right? Except a prison record, right? And so how do you get over that hump? And it's that creative thinking, right? And who would be the right partner? So they knew something about the economy too. You can't think of everything as being in a silo. Let's go into the prison and teach everyone, philosophy, right? Nothing against philosophy, I'm all for it, but or teach them, I don't know, hair cutting techniques when you've already got 5 barbers in town. I mean, you just sort of, what are you going to do? Are you going to teach them something that helps them move away, or, and the same thing with young people who you want to have stay. How can you get them exposed when they're still there to business opportunities that actually exist in this town? And a lot of them have no concept of what goes on in business. There's a community foundation, Parkersburg in West Virginia, that they started a program where they would get kids in college that were from Parkersburg area to come back and work in local businesses in the summer. And they would pay them a stipend to work in those businesses. So they were earning money. So they used philanthropic dollars to pay stipends. And so all of them learned about individual businesses in their community they really didn't know anything about. They didn't understand there were employment opportunities there. They helped the businesses because they were young people who had a lot more savvy on things like websites and Twitter or whatever they were doing. And then in addition to which, they would convene all of the young people together to learn more about the community, about its history, about its culture. So they were building connections that those kids didn't have just coming out of high school, through the college years, making it more attractive as an option, right? There's a systematic thinking there, right? Because we lose them. Once they go to college, we lose them and they don't come back, right? So they're saying, well, how can we strengthen connections? Stuff like that.
We've got about a minute left before our 1 o'clock deadline. And this is really a very interesting conversation. So I know it's hard to end. I
love talking about this stuff. I can go on forever, obviously.
Claudia actually shared in the chat about a meeting that she had just attended last night about with the Cumberland Gap Regional Tourism Association that's made up with counties that are across state lines even. And so these rural development hubs can operate in multiple counties if they identify something to work on, multiple states. I mean, do you see that happen too?
Working across state lines?
Across state lines, yes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ones that we know a lot about is the Northern Forest Center, which covers the Northern Forest, which is, parts of Maine, all of Vermont, parts of New Hampshire, parts of New York State. The Northern Forest goes across there, where we've helped facilitate whole summits across those 4 states where they realized that outdoor recreation was becoming more of an economic driver. And there were little hints of it, but they hadn't talked to each other. So the Northern Forest Center brought 150 people together from different parts of those states. Some of them were businesses, some of them were workforce development, some of them were state people, some of them were workers, some of them were, users of outdoor recreation, to sort of say, how can we make some of these, seasonal jobs full year jobs by having people work both in the summer sports and the winter sports? How can we do this, that, and the other? What do we need to know about technology to make the visitor experience better? How can we all get better at like the GPS apps on our thing, so people who come here to hike or trail bike, can use the GPS? There's a lot they can teach each other, and they can connect each other. In other words, how can my business here promote yours in Vermont and promote this, that, and the other? Because when people come here, they could stay a night there too. But if you don't bring people together to talk about that, it's not going to happen. And by working together, you can then also possibly tap other sources of money, because you achieve scale that looks investable. And so, yes, cross state lines can work too, as long as it's I'll stop with this. As long as it's a region that makes sense. I like to talk about it as an actionscape, right? What is the right landscape for action on a particular issue? And it might be different on childcare as compared to workforce development, as compared to something else. So different issues or opportunities have a different actionscape. So don't think that the geographic region in which we work on, tourism is the same geographic region that we work on for, fill in the blank.
And
Don't be tied to those
rates.
groups.
Well,
So maybe one more thing from Melissa, and then
well, this is actually a question, kind of summarizing everything that you have shared with us today. I'm interested in understanding what the resources are that your organization has for our little community. So I understand you've got print materials, and we're familiar with those, and kind of checking out your website. But what other kinds of resources or services do you have that we might be able to tap into?
We have a staff of 5 to cover the nation right now. We try to work. We work sometimes on the ground with different people. I've worked with individual community foundations to help set strategy, to help board of directors figure out what they want to do, all that kind of stuff. We've done a lot of that. So we can do that when we have the time and the bandwidth, right, so to speak. We are right now really focused on, a framework for they call Thrive Rural, which is what are the things that really need to be in place for different regions to do better. And so we're really engaged in a lot of that. We do a lot of webinars sharing different kinds of innovation. So if you go to the website, you will find like 2 or 3 years of webinars or things that have different people from across the country who are doing innovative stuff in rural talk about their work. And they're there. There are lots of handouts that you can get there. It's not like there's here's the roadmap period, right? Because it's so we are not like some of the national organizations that have a vast network of organizations that only do infrastructure and water, where they've got technical assistance teams and government money to do their work. So I'm not trying to evade your question. I'm just saying there's lots of stuff we can do. The question is, what do you want to do, right? And then we can let you know if we have anything we think can help, or we can route you to someone who we think can. I'm always telling community foundations that are working on, for example, issue X, well, you should talk to these 3 other community foundations because they've made progress. So we're an information resource. We're really sort of like a hub of what's going on and trying to share that with others, both to inspire them, but also to route them to other resources that can be helpful. All right.
And I would say about that question too, that the community strategic planning work that we've done, we hope that under the umbrella of the foundation, that can, engage all the affiliate boards in the work that the foundation also is doing under its umbrella in the region moving forward. So, it's connecting and interlapping efforts from the different affiliates into, identifying areas where there can be regional work that could be done. And so we sent out the invitation for this webinar. One of the things that we included was that kind of overview of the strategic plans that folks have done so far. And there are things in there like several of the affiliates want to pursue private foundation funds to come in and do specific work. So what if instead of thinking of that in your community alone, you think of that, how can we do that regionally?
I also put in the chat that we're trying to track lots of information about federal resources, and we're keeping this like updated pretty much daily. There are information sessions on different federal programs as well as analyses, et cetera, et cetera. So I just put that in there. That's another thing that if you're trying to track what's going on in different issue areas coming down from the federal government, keep your eye on that page. Just keep coming back to it. And happy to add you all to our mailing list. We do a newsletter on different stuff that's coming out that other people are doing. So Donna, if you want to share their emails, I'll be happy to add that.
Okay. This has been great. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks
Got
so
to go to a
much,
staff
Janet.
meeting now.
Yes. Thank you so much. And
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Everybody have a great day and thank you.
Say hello to Kentucky for me.
Yes.
Okay. Take care.